Elias Thorne watched the dust motes dance in a singular, defiant shaft of amber light that had managed to pierce the grime of his workshop window. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, the hour when the Cornish sun began its slow, bruised descent toward the Celtic Sea, casting long, skeletal shadows across the workbench. In Penmerrow, time did not so much pass as it sedimented, layering itself in the salt crust on the window panes and the slow oxidation of brass gears. Elias was a man of escapements and mainsprings, a restorer of things that had forgotten how to move. He sat hunched over a late Victorian bracket clock, his loop pressed against his eye socket like a glass parasite. To the outside world, he was a silent fixture of High Street, as dependable and weathered as the granite quay. Inside, however, he was a vast, echoing hall of silences. He often felt that his own internal pendulum had swung wide and snapped its suspension spring years ago, leaving him suspended in a permanent, breathless noon. The clock before him was stubborn. It belonged to the Penhaligon estate family, whose name was etched into the very cliffs of the village. The mechanism was fouled with years of neglect, a microscopic wilderness of congealed oil and grit. As Elias carefully prodded a pallet stone, he thought of how easily a life could become gummed up. A single grief, if left untended, could harden into a resin that stopped the heart's gears entirely. His mind drifted, as it always did when the light hit that specific angle, to the house on the cliff edge where Sarah used to hang wildflowers to dry. He could almost smell the ghosts of lavender and chamomile over the sharp, metallic tang of his cleaning fluids. It had been 5 years since the house had fallen silent, yet he still caught himself listening for the floorboards to groan under a step. He lived in the gaps between ticks, in the infinitesimal silences that most people were too busy to notice. A bell chimed above the shop door, a bright, silver sound that felt violent in the heavy stillness of the room. Elias did not look up immediately. He finished securing a tiny screw. His breath held steady. Only when the metal was seated did he exhale and push the loop onto his forehead. Standing in the doorway was Clara Penhaligon. She was not the frail, aristocratic ghost he had imagined from the dusty clock's provenance. She was a woman of perhaps 40, wearing a waxed barber jacket that had seen better decades and boots caked in the dark, rich earth of the valley. Her hair was a chaotic crown of copper and grey, windswept and smelling faintly of sea spray and rosemary. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice a low, melodic rasp. "I was told you were the only man in the West Country who could speak to the dead." Elias stood slowly, his joints protesting the sudden movement. "I fix clocks, Miss Penhaligon. I don't hold seances." "Is there a difference?" she asked, stepping further into the shop. She moved with a strange, rhythmic grace, her eyes wandering over the walls lined with ticking carcasses. "Most of these belong to people who are long gone. You keep their heartbeat going. That seems like a form of necromancy to me." Elias wiped his hands on a dark, oily rag. "It's just physics, tension, release, friction. There's no magic in a balanced wheel." "And yet," she said, leaning over his workbench to peer at the disassembled Victorian, "when it stops, the room feels different, doesn't it? The silence is heavier. It's a physical weight." Elias looked at her then, really looked at her. Her eyes were the color of the sea after a storm of turbulent, unsettling green. He saw a mirrored fracture in her expression, a shadow behind the brightness that he recognized with the weary instinct of a fellow traveler. "The mainspring is set," he said, his voice softening, "but the pivot holes are worn. It's been running on friction alone for a long time. It's tired." Clara touched the mahogany casing of the clock with the tips of her fingers. "Aren't we all? I found it in the attic after my mother passed. She used to say that when this clock stopped, the family's luck would run out. It stopped the night the Great Gale took the old pier in '96. No one bothered to wind it again. We just grew used to the stillness." "Stillness can be addictive," Elias murmured, almost to himself. "It's safer than the ticking. Ticking implies a destination. It implies that time is running out, or that it's arriving," Clara countered. She looked toward the window, where the amber light was deepening into a rich, burnt orange. "I've started the gardens again. You know, at the estate, the brambles had taken everything. I spent the morning clearing the south terrace. The sun hits it first thing. It's the only place where the frost doesn't bite." Elias imagined the south terrace. He remembered it from his childhood, a place of white stone and overflowing hydrangeas. "The soil there is full of salt," he said. "Nothing delicate survives the winter." "Then we don't plant delicate things," she replied. "We plant the resilient ones, the ones that know how to bend without breaking." She stayed for an hour, though she had no other business. They spoke of the weather, of the changing tide of the village, holiday makers fled for the season, and of the peculiar way the light in Cornwall seemed to possess its own weight. Elias found himself speaking more than he had in months. It was as if she had brought a gust of the outside air into his hermetically sealed world, blowing away the fine layer of dust that had settled over his thoughts. When she left, the shop felt impossibly large and cold. He returned to the workbench, but the Victorian clock no longer held his focus. He kept thinking about the south terrace, about the idea of planting things in salt-poisoned earth. He looked at his hands stained with oil, calloused, the hands of a man who worked in the past. He wondered, with a sudden, sharp pang of anxiety, if he had forgotten how to look forward. The following weeks fell into a new, tentative rhythm. Clara would return every Tuesday, ostensibly to check on the progress of the clock. But they both knew the repairs were being dragged out by Elias's sudden, meticulous obsession with perfection. He polished every tooth of every gear. He burnished the brass until it glowed like a fallen star. One afternoon, the rain was lashing against the windows in grey, diagonal sheets, turning Penmerrow into a blurred watercolour. Clara arrived soaked to the bone, laughing as she shook her umbrella. "The Atlantic is trying to reclaim the high street today," she said, shedding her coat. Elias stood and, for the first time, offered her tea. They sat in the small back room, surrounded by crates of spare parts and the smell of Earl Grey. "Why do you stay here, Elias?" she asked suddenly, in the dark. He looked into his cup, watching the steam curl. "I'm a restorer. I belong where things are broken. But who restores the restorer?" The question hung in the air, vibrating like a struck tuning fork. Elias felt a sudden, terrifying urge to tell her everything about the way Sarah's laughter used to fill the gaps between the chimes, about the day the oncologist's voice had sounded like a clock stopping, and about the 5 years he had spent trying to find a way to wind his own heart back up. "I don't think I'm fixable," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Some parts are missing. You can't replace an original movement once it's lost." Clara reached across the small table and placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm, a startling contrast to the cold metal he handled all day. "You don't replace it," she said softly. "You modify it. You build around the gap. It's not the same. No, it's something else. Something that knows the value of the remaining time." In that moment, the clouds outside parted for a fleeting second. A stray beam of sunlight, pale and watery, caught the edge of a crystal vase on the shelf, refracting a small, trembling rainbow onto Elias's hand. He watched the colours dance across his skin, over the scars and the oil stains. "The clock is finished," he said, his throat tight. "You can take it home tomorrow." "Good," she said, though she didn't move her hand. "But only if you promise to come and help me set it. The mantel in the morning room isn't level. It needs a steady eye." The walk to the Penhaligon estate the next day was a journey through a landscape Elias had long avoided. He carried the bracket clock wrapped in soft baize, cradling it like a sleeping child. The climb up the cliff path made his lungs burn, the air sharp with the scent of gorse and wet earth. When he reached the house, he found Clara in the garden. She was kneeling in the dirt of the south terrace, her hands deep in the soil. The sun was out in full force, a brilliant, unshielded gold that turned the sea into a sheet of hammered silver. "You're just in time," she called out, standing and wiping her brow with a muddy sleeve. "The light is perfect." He followed her inside. The morning room was vast and airy, a stark contrast to his cramped workshop. The walls were a faded cream, and the windows looked out over the infinite horizon. He placed the clock on the mantelpiece, a heavy slab of local slate. With practiced, trembling fingers, he set the clock in motion. He leveled the base with small shims of wood, listening to the beat. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was a clean, even sound. The Victorian heart was beating again, its golden pendulum swinging with renewed purpose. "Listen," Clara whispered, standing beside him. They stood in silence, the clock's rhythm filling the room. It seemed to harmonize with the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. "It sounds alive," she said. Elias looked at her. The sunlight was flooding through the tall windows, catching the copper in her hair and the lines of weariness and hope on her face. For the first time in 5 years, the silence in his own mind didn't feel like a void. It felt like a space waiting to be filled. "It's just a machine, Clara," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," she said, turning to face him. "It's a witness. It says, I am here, and the sun is rising, and we have this hour." She stepped closer, and for a moment, Elias felt the gravity of his own grief shifting. It was still there, a heavy, dense call, but it was no longer the only thing he possessed. The sunlight was warm on his back, a physical touch that seemed to reach through his skin, through the layers of oil and metal, into the cold machinery of his soul. "I haven't been to the South Terrace in a long time," he admitted. "Then let's go," she said, reaching for his hand. "The sea kale is coming up, and I think the rosemary has finally taken hold." As they walked out into the brilliance of the Cornish afternoon, the clock in the morning room continued its steady, relentless march. Behind them, the house seemed to exhale, the long-held breath of a decade's silence finally released. Elias looked out over the cliffs. The world was too bright, too loud, and entirely too fast, but as he felt Clara's hand in his, he realized that a broken heart didn't have to be a discarded one. Like the clocks in his shop, it could be cleaned, it could be oiled, it could be adjusted. The light hit the water, shattering into a million brilliant fragments, and for the first time, Elias Thorne didn't count the seconds, he simply lived them. He watched a kestrel hover on the updraft, a speck of life against the blue, and he felt the gears of his own life begin to turn slowly, tentatively, but with a new and sudden grace. The salt was still there, and the wind would always blow, but as they stood on the edge of the land, where the earth met the infinite sky, the sunlight touched the broken places and found, to his quiet amazement, that they were capable of reflecting the light. They walked toward the terrace, two figures etched against the gold, leaving the shadows of the workshop far behind. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the sea, the wind, and the steady, unbreakable heartbeat of a clock that had finally decided it was time to move again. The garden was a riot of defiant greens. Clara led him to a corner where the stone wall offered a small sanctuary from the prevailing gale. There, nestled in the lee of the granite, were tiny, pale blue flowers, Scylla, shivering but upright. "They shouldn't be blooming now," Elias remarked, his voice finding a new resonance in the open air. "It's too late in the season." "They don't know that," Clara replied, kneeling once more in the dirt. "They only know that the sun is hitting this specific patch of earth today. They aren't waiting for spring. They're making use of the light they have." Elias knelt beside her. The dampness of the earth seeped into his trousers, a grounded, tactile sensation that tethered him to the present. He reached out and touched a leaf, the texture surprising him fleshy and resilient. He thought of his workshop, the rows of silent faces, the meticulous, lonely hours spent in the dark. He thought of the way he had curated his own misery, polishing it until it shone like a trophy. "I've spent so long waiting for the right time," he said softly. "I forgot that time is what happens while you're waiting." Clara looked at him, her face framed by the vast, unfolding sky. "The clock on the mantle isn't just counting down, Elias, it's counting up. Every second is an addition, not a subtraction. He looked at his hands, the hands of a restorer, and for the first time in years, he didn't see the stains of the past. He saw the potential for the next movement. He saw the way the sunlight caught the ridges of his knuckles, turning the mundane into something luminous. In the distance, the lighthouse at Trevo's Head began its first faint pulse of the evening, a rhythmic blink against the gathering dusk. It was a signal, a reminder that even in the dark, there were things that kept watch. Elias took a breath, the air tasting of salt and turning leaves. It was a cold breath, a sharp one, but it felt remarkably like a beginning. He didn't know how to be whole again, but as he watched Clara tend to her stubborn, salt-sprayed garden, he realized he didn't have to be whole to be functional. He just had to keep the pendulum moving. "Tell me about the rosemary," he said, and the words were a bridge, a fragile, golden thread spanning the distance between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving a trail of violet and rose madder across the sky. The day was over, but as they walked back toward the house, the light remained not in the sky, but in the steady, rhythmic beat of the clock on the mantel and in the quiet, unfolding warmth of a heart that had finally allowed itself to be touched. "It is for the things we must carry," Clara Penhaligon said, her voice a low thrum against the rising murmur of the tide. She reached out, her fingers brushing the needle-like leaves of the rosemary bush, releasing a scent that was sharp, medicinal, and ancient. "People say it's for remembrance, Elias, but they often mistake that for a burden. They think it's about the weight of what's gone. I think it's more about the fragrance of what remains." Elias watched her hand move. To a man who dealt in the microscopic, the hairsprings, and the escaped jewels of a movement, there was something terrifyingly vast about her grace. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one he had cultivated like a rare, poisonous orchid in the hothouse of his isolation. But the scent of the rosemary was invasive. It cut through the stale, metallic air of his lungs, demanding a space that hadn't been occupied in years. He thought of his late wife, Julienne, not as a ghost haunting the corners of the workshop, but as a melody he had once known by heart, one that was now being hummed by the wind. The threshold of the kitchen door felt like a border between two countries. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of cold stone and the tang of watch oil, the scent of his life's work, which had slowly become his life's prison. Outside, the sky was a bruised plum, the stars beginning to prick through the veil of the atmosphere like the points of fine-tipped tweezers. He stepped over the lintel, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't feel the need to immediately check the regulator clock in the hallway. The frantic urge to synchronize his world had quieted. He realized, with a jolt of internal friction, that his obsession with precision had been a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding of his own history. If he could only keep the seconds perfectly aligned, he had told himself, perhaps the years wouldn't feel so fractured. It was a fallacy of the highest order, a mechanic's delusion. "Will you stay for tea?" Elias asked. The question felt heavy and strange on his tongue, like an antique coin he'd found beneath a floorboard. It was an invitation to a witness, a request for her to see the clutter of his living. Clara smiled, a small, weary curve of the lips that suggested she knew exactly what it cost him to speak. "I'd like that, Elias. The kettle knows its way to the flame, I'm sure." They moved into the kitchen, a room of shadows and copper pans that hadn't seen a guest since the last frost of a different era. Elias navigated the space with a ghost-like efficiency. He lit the gas ring, the blue flame blooming of a sudden flower in the dimness. He found the porcelain cups, the ones with the delicate willow pattern, thin enough to see the light through, and wiped away a thin film of dust with a linen cloth. He was intensely aware of her presence behind him. She didn't hover. She simply occupied the space, a grounding force that made the room feel smaller and, paradoxically, less hollow. He wondered what she saw: the stack of newspapers from months ago, the single chair at the table, the way the light from the hallway only reached halfway across the floor. He felt a flush of shame, a heat that prickled at the back of his neck, but when he turned to set the tray, Her eyes were not on his mess. She was looking at a small, wooden clock on the dresser, a simple piece, unadorned. Its pendulum stilled. That one doesn't tick, she noted softly. It's a cuckoo from the Black Forest, Elias said, his voice tightening. The bellows are perished. It's been waiting for leather for 7 years. Is it waiting for leather? Or is it waiting for you? The question was a needle strike to a nerve. He turned away to pour the tea, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. I've had more important movements to attend to. High-grade chronometers, marine regulators, a cuckoo is a toy that tells someone when it's time to come home, Clara countered. She took the cup he offered, her fingers briefly touching his. Her skin was cold from the garden, but her grip was steady. There is a difference between a machine that keeps time and a heart that marks it, Elias. You've spent so much energy on the machines that the heart has grown stiff. He sat opposite her, the steam from his tea veiling his face. He thought of the thousands of hours he had spent hunched over his bench in the Blackwood Cove workshop. The loop pressed to his eye, reducing the world to a series of interlocking clocks. He had loved the logic of it. If a clock stopped, there was always a reason: a broken tooth, a dried oil, a grain of dust. You could find the fault, you could fix it, you could return the world to its proper rhythm. But grief was not a mechanical failure. It was a flood that warped the wood and rusted the springs beyond repair. There was no tool in his velvet-lined cases that could recalibrate the silence Julian had left behind. I don't know how to be in the world without the ticking, he confessed, the words spilling out before he could filter them. The silence. It's too heavy. It presses against my ears. I keep the clocks going, so I don't have to hear the sound of my own thoughts. Clara leaned forward, the amber light of the kitchen lamp catching the silver in her hair. Then let them tick, Elias, but let them tick for the future, not as a barricade against the past. You've turned this house into a mausoleum of seconds. You're not keeping time, you're hoarding it. He looked at his hands, calloused, stained with rouge and oil, the hands of a man who had tried to build a fortress out of minutes. He thought of the garden, the scilla flowers blooming in the teeth of the salt wind, indifferent to the correct season. They weren't waiting for a perfect mechanism. They were simply responding to the touch of the sun. I had a dream once, he said, his voice barely a whisper, that I had found the great regulator, the clock that governed everything. I opened the case, expecting to see the most complex escapement ever devised. But when I looked inside, there was nothing, no gears, no springs. Just a vast, empty space, and the sound of a long, slow breath. Clara watched him, her expression unreadable, but deeply attentive. And did it frighten you? It terrified me, Elias said, because if there's no mechanism, I have no purpose. If life isn't a series of gears I can control, then what am I? You are the breath, Elias, she said, not the clock. Outside, the wind rose, a sudden gust that rattled the window pane in its frame. The old house groaned, its timbers shifting like the ribs of a great wooden ship. For the first time in years, Elias didn't reach for his tools to tighten a screw or oil a hinge. He simply sat in the fading light, listening to the house breathe. He looked at the cuckoo clock on the dresser. It was a humble thing, carved from linden wood, its little wooden bird trapped behind a tiny door. He thought of the leather bellows, dry and cracked like old parchment. He thought of the simple, rhythmic chirp that had once filled his kitchen on the hour, a sound that Julian had loved because it was cheeky. I think, he said, his voice gaining a sudden, unexpected clarity, that I might have some scraps of goat skin in the workshop for the bellows. Clara's smile widened, not with triumph, but with a quiet, shared understanding. It's a start, Elias Thorne, a very fine start. The tea grew cold in their cups, but the warmth in the room remained. As the moon rose over the jagged silhouette of the Cornish cliffs, casting a silver path across the restless Atlantic, the man who had spent a decade counting the seconds finally began to understand that some things, the most important things, could never be measured by a pendulum. They could only be felt in the quiet, stuttering beat of a heart that was learning, second by painful second, how to open its doors to the light. The workshop was a cathedral of suspended animation, a place where the air itself seemed to have been filtered through a century of fine dust and the evaporated spirits of lubricating oils. Elias Thorne moved through the shadows with the practiced grace of a man who knew exactly where the floorboards groaned and where the darkness poured deepest. He didn't turn on the electric light. Instead, he struck a match, the flare illuminating his weathered face for a flickering second before he settled the flame into the wick of an old brass hurricane lamp. The light bloomed, honeygold and trembling, stretching the shadows of his lathes and vices across the stone walls of the Blackwood Cove cottage. For years, this room had been his fortress. Here, he was the architect of order, but as he stood before the workbench, the silence of the house felt different, less like a vacuum and more like a held breath. He found the goat skin in a cedar chest beneath the window. It was supple, smelling of tannin and old earth. As his fingers traced the grain, he thought of Julian's hands. She had been a weaver by trade, her life governed by the rhythmic thrum of the loom, a different kind of timekeeping altogether. He remembered how she would watch him work, her head tilted, a stray lock of chestnut hair always escaping her copper pin. "You're trying to catch the wind in a box, Elias," she had told him once, laughing as he struggled with a particularly stubborn escapement. "You think if you make the box beautiful enough, the wind will stay. But the wind doesn't want to stay. It only wants to pass through." At the time, he had found the sentiment poetic but impractical. Now, with the goatskin draped over his palm, he felt the weight of her wisdom like a physical pressure against his chest. He had spent a decade building boxes, trying to trap the seconds, trying to ensure that not a single moment of her existence could leak away into the ether. But in doing so, he had stopped the wind from blowing at all. He picked up a pair of fine-pointed shears. The metal was cold, a familiar sting against his thumb. He began to cut the leather for the cuckoo clock's bellows. The task was small, almost trivial compared to the intricate chronometers he usually repaired, yet his hands shook with a sudden, unbidden tremor. This wasn't about precision. It was about restoration. It was about allowing a cheeky sound back into a house that had become a tomb of solemnity. As he worked, his mind drifted to Port Haven, the small fishing village that clung to the cliffs just a mile south. He remembered the Sunday mornings they would walk along the harbour wall, the salt spray stinging their cheeks. Julian would point out the way the light hit the hulls of the trawlers, the Mary Ann, the pride of the West End remark that the blue of the water was never the same blue twice. "How can you measure that, Elias?" she'd ask. "How do you put a number on the way the tide turns?" He hadn't had an answer then. He had only reached for his pocket watch, checking if they were on schedule for lunch at the Mariner's Rest. He winced at the memory. He had been so busy counting the minutes that he had missed the light on the water. The glue pot hissed on the small stove in the corner, the scent of rabbit skin glue rising in a pungent, nostalgic cloud. He applied the adhesive with a tiny brush, his movement slowing, becoming more deliberate. He wasn't just fixing a clock, he was performing a kind of surgery on his own heart. Each fold of the lever, each tiny tack driven into the wood, was a confession. "I am sorry," he thought, the words echoing in the private chambers of his mind. "I am sorry I tried to make you stay in the ticking. I am sorry I didn't listen to the breath." The night deepened, outside. The Atlantic continued its ancient, relentless assault on the Cornish granite, a sound that had no beginning and no end. It was the sound of eternity, a clock that never needed winding. Elias stopped working for a moment and looked toward the darkened window. He could see his own reflection in the glass, a ghost haunting his own life. Behind him, the rows of clocks stood like silent sentinels, their pendulums still, their faces blank. He realized then that Clara was right. He had been hoarding time, stacking it up like gold coins in a vault, terrified that, if he spent even a second of it, he would be left with nothing. But time wasn't currency. It was more like the scilla flowers in the garden brief, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to his desire for permanence. By the time he had finished the bellows, the first hint of a grey, watery dawn was beginning to bleed into the eastern sky over the moors. His eyes were dry and burning, his back ached, and his fingers were stained with glue and soot. But when he picked up the little wooden bird and manually tilted the bellows, a soft, wheezing cuckoo echoed through the workshop. It was a ridiculous sound. It was imperfect, slightly out of tune, and entirely devoid of the mathematical majesty of a precision regulator. Elias Thorne put the bird down and, for the first time in 10 years, he wept. They weren't the sharp, jagged tears of the newly bereaved. They were slow and heavy, like the first rains after a long drought. He sat on his high stool, his head bowed over the workbench, and let the grief wash over him. He let it warp the wood of his resolve. He let it rust the springs of his isolation. He sat there until the sun finally breached the horizon, casting a long, pale finger of light through the workshop window. The light touched the brass gears of a dismantled carriage clock, making them glow like fallen stars. It touched the jars of oil, the bundles of wire, and the silver hair on Elias's head. And finally, it touched the cuckoo clock, sitting there on the bench, waiting for its voice to be heard. He stood up, his bones creaking, and carried the clock back into the kitchen. The house was still, but the air felt thinner, easier to breathe. Clara was gone. She must have slipped out to the guest room, or perhaps back to her own cottage in the village, but she had left a fresh pot of tea warming on the range. Elias hung the cuckoo clock on its hook. He pulled the weights, the heavy pine cones of cast iron descending with a familiar, metallic rasp. He set the pendulum in motion. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was just a clock. It wasn't Julian. It wasn't a bridge to the past. It was simply a machine that marked the present. He watched the minute hand creep toward the 12. His heart hammered in his ribs, a frantic, living thing. The clock struck the hour. The little door swung open. The bird popped out, its painted wings stiff, and delivered its message to the empty room. Cuckoo, cuckoo. Elias closed his eyes. He didn't think of the gears. He didn't think of the bellows. He thought of the wind on the harbour wall. He thought of the blue of the water that was never the same blue twice. He thought of the long, slow breath of the universe, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the space inside. He walked to the back door and opened it. The morning air was sharp with the scent of brine and damp earth. The garden was a riot of untamed green, the scilla flowers nodding in the breeze. He stepped out onto the grass, his boots soaking up the dew, and walked toward the edge of the cliff. The sun was a pale gold coin rising out of the sea. Elias Thorne stood at the precipice, the wind tugging at his coat, and watched the light break across the waves. He wasn't counting the seconds. He wasn't timing the tide. He was simply there, a man standing at the edge of the world, learning how to be the breath instead of the clock. Far below, a gull cried out, a lonely, piercing sound that was lost almost instantly in the roar of the surf. Elias smiled, a small, tentative movement of muscles that had forgotten their purpose. The world was vast, and he was small, and the time he had left wasn't a fortress to be guarded. It was an ocean, and he was finally ready to set sail. The silence of the workshop was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a sarcophagus. Elias Thorne felt the weight of his own lungs, heavy and stagnant, as if the very air had calcified within the brass gears and iron weights of his isolation. He looked at the rows of regulators, those marble-faced deities of his own making, and saw them for what they were, monuments to a man who had tried to build a cage for the wind. He had been a harder of seconds, stacking them like silver shillings in a vault, convinced that if he could only measure time with enough precision, he could prevent it from stealing what was left of his soul. But time, he realized as the first watery grey of a Cornish dawn bled through the skylight, was not a currency to be saved. It was the scilla flowers nodding in the salt-stung grass outside, brief, luminous, and utterly indifferent to his desire for permanence. His fingers, cracked and stained with the soot of the forge and the amber tack of hide glue, trembled as he picked up the small wooden bird. It was a crude thing compared to the escapements of his masterworks. He manually tilted the bellows he had spent the night reconstructing. A soft, wheezing cuckoo echoed through the rafters. It was a ridiculous sound. It was out of tune, a breathy, stuttering hiccup that possessed none of the mathematical majesty of a precision chronometer. Yet, in the hollow of his chest, something brittle finally snapped. Elias did not collapse. He simply leaned his forehead against the cool, scarred wood of the workbench and let the reservoir of 10 years' worth of unspent sorrow burst its banks. These were not the jagged, frantic tears of the newly broken. They were slow and viscous, like the first rains after a long drought, soaking into the dust of his apron. He let the grief warp the seasoned timber of his resolve. He let it rust the springs of his solitude. He sat there, a man of 64 years, weeping for the wife who had loved the messiness of the world, and for the husband who had tried to fix that world until it stopped moving altogether. By the time the sun breached the horizon over the jagged spine of the moors, the workshop had transformed. The light did not merely illuminate the space, it interrogated it. It touched the dismantled guts of a carriage clock, turning the brass wheels into fallen stars. It caught the motes of dust dancing in the air, revealing a hidden, frantic life in the very emptiness he had cultivated. And finally, it rested upon the cuckoo clock, which sat on the bench like a patient, expectant child. Elias stood, his joints creaking like the timbers of a ship at anchor. He carried the clock into the kitchen. The cottage felt different. The air was thinner, the shadows less predatory. Clara was gone, likely retreated to her own home in the village, or perhaps resting in the guest room. But she had left the auger humming and a fresh pot of Earl Grey warming beneath a knitted cozy. The domesticity of it felt like an invitation. He hung the clock on the heavy iron nail above the mantel. He pulled the chains, the cast iron pine cones descending with a familiar, rhythmic rasp that sounded, for the first time, like music. He touched the pendulum, a simple brass disc, and gave it a nudge. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was merely a machine. It was not Julian's voice, nor was it a bridge to the years he had lost. It was simply a device that marked the present, a heartbeat for a house that had been clinically dead for a decade. He watched the minute hand creep toward the vertical. His own heart hammered against his ribs, a living, uncalibrated thing. The hour struck. The small wooden door sprang open with a defiant click. The bird emerged, its painted wings stiff, and announced the arrival of the morning to the empty, sun-drenched room. Cuckoo, cuckoo. Elias closed his eyes and inhaled the scent of damp stone and wood smoke. He didn't think of the friction of the pivots or the tension of the springs. He thought of the wind on the harbour wall at St. Ives. He thought of the way Julian's hair had smelled of salt and gore.